The Owl and the Nightingale is a verse debate between the two birds about their relative merits. It has dropped the Anglo-Saxon alliteration altogether. It is written in the rhyming octosyllabic couplets of the French. All the above mentioned works were produced during the first quarter of the 13th century. The rest of the century is a blank. The principal productions of the first half of the 14th century may be considered briefly under three heads. First, religious, second one is romance, and third one is a lyric. So now we are going to start the first one, that is religious. Out of the three important religious works, all religious works are written in verse. The first one was Handling Sin, Handlying, as and Sin, which was written by Robert Manning. It is a translation from the French. It contains stories or fables about various sins. The other verse work is Cursor Mundi, Cursor, Cursor Mundi, Mundi. It is a huge poem in octosyllabic couplets giving the whole story of the Bible together with the lives of the saints, all enriched by the imagination of the anonymous author. The third one is The Prick of Conscience, written by Richard Rowley of Hampole. It is a remarkable hermit. It is an octosyllabic couplet sprinkled with decasyllabic lines and describes in detail the horrifying tortures of hell. The next form of poem, that was a romance, which were written in Middle English literature between 1066 to 1350. Romance is the most important literary genre. It is the subkind of poetry, the most important branch of English literature cultivated during this period and for long afterwards was romance. Stories of love and chivalry were very popular in France, the most popular being chansons de geste, which are called songs of heroic deeds. It centered around Charles Magne and his knights. These became popular in England. It led to the production of a great number of romances dealing with heroes of France, Rome, Britain, and England. The most interesting of those produced during the first half of the 14th century is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The Green Knight appears before King Arthur and the knights of his round table and challenges anyone to strike him a blow on the condition that he will submit to a return blow from the Green Knight after a year at the Green Chapel. Sir Gawain gives the blow and cuts off his head to the amazement of all. A year after, on his way to the Green Chapel, Sir Gawain stays at a castle. He is lavishly entertained by his host. He is visited by the host wife who tempts him, but he resists her except taking a few kisses and a magic girdle which makes its wearer invulnerable. According to a bargain, according to a bargain with the host that they will exchange whatever they gain by hunting or other means. He returns the kisses, but he keeps the girdle in view of the awful appointment with the Green Knight. It is needless to say, It is the host himself who had planned the temptation. For his steadfastness in resisting the main temptation, the Green Knight saves Gwen's life, inflicting only a slight wound for his concealment of the girdle invulnerability. This poem is Anglo-Saxon in its alliterative verse and vocabulary, but it is remarkable not only for its story, interest, but also for its powerful descriptions and touches of humor dealing with Charles Magne. Besides the Arthurian circle, there were hundreds of other romances, most of them translations or adaptations from French originals, dealing with French, English, classical, and even Oriental subjects. Now, next form of the poetry is lyric, which also became important part for the contribution of literature in Middle Age. The third department of literature that was open to English was the lyric. Love is an important motive in lyric, and this was absent in Anglo-Saxon poetry. Moreover, lyric being subjective or personal demands variety of meter of which Anglo-Saxon was incapable. These were now supplied by French examples which led to the production of a large number of charming lyrics in England. A few of these have found a place in anthologies. Specimens that follow are the Cuckoo Song and Alison. Alison is a love song. After that, we should continue the literature which produced in the Middle English, especially in the time 1350 to 1400, and there was so much production of literature which became famous in the world. Talking about the historical background in this era, if you want to appreciate the work of Chaucer and his contemporaries in its proper perspective, it is necessary to recall to our minds the chief historical persons and events of their times. Chaucer lived through the reigns of two kings, Edward III and Richard II, and saw the beginning of third, that was Henry IV. His age presents a glaring contrast between its earlier and later years. At the time of his birth, the Hundred Years' War had already begun, and as a boy, he must have heard of the victories of Edward III and the Black Prince. A still greater victory was won at home a little later when English became the language of the law courts and of parliament. The victories of Crecy, Crecy, and Poitiers, Poitiers, aroused a new spirit of national unity and pride. But it produced little literature except a few patriotic songs. All the great works of this period were produced during the latter and troubled years which followed upon the death of Edward III. The reign of Richard II was one of the worst that England has ever known. He was incompetent, capricious, and extravagant. The Great Plague or Black Death had devastated the land. Labor shortage, low wages, and high taxation to meet the cost of the French wars had greatly increased the misery of the masses. The poll tax levied by Richard II led directly to the Peasants' Revolt or Wattles Rebellion, which was put down with a heavy hand. To the social and political troubles of the times were added religious troubles caused by a corrupt church. The bishops, who had amassed great wealth, lived a life of ease and luxury, The lowly clergy were ignorant and indolent, and even the friars who had done good work in the beginning had become notoriously greedy and corrupt. This general corruption in the church roused John Wycliffe to a fury of reform through his pamphlets and preachers. His followers came to be known as Lollards and their movement Lollardy. The movement caused many uprisings, but they were all mercilessly suppressed. Lollardy went Lollardy went underground, and the Reformation in England was delayed by 150 years. John Wycliffe is the morning star of Reformation. He had done his work not only by his crusade against the corruption of the church, but also by translating the Gospels into English. Curiously enough, it was during this troubled and unhappy period that English poetry entered upon its first blossoming season. The two races had become almost one, and in spite of many sided social unrest, there was a general feeling of national independence and pride. This newborn spirit found expression not only in satire, denunciation, and lamentation, but also in the joy of life. The three poets of this period are Geoffrey Chaucer, William Langland, and John Gower. As a Chaucer is much the greatest of the three and needs a more detailed consideration, let us we shall discuss about the one of the greatest poet in this era, whose name was William Langland. Talking about William Langland, he was the traditional author of Piers Plowman. Piers Plowman is the last great writing, and the poem also very famous in this era. Langland was the great poet to write in the Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse, and the work written by William Langland titled Piers Plowman was the revival of an absolute technique late in the 14th century is an unsolved mystery. The author himself also remains a mystery, for little definite is known about him. From evidence both external and internal, the personality of the author built up by scholars is as follows. He was born about 1332 in the western part of England near the Malvern Hills. Educated in a monastery school and having failed as a churchman in minor orders, he shifted to London. Here he made his living as a beggar singing psalms for the souls of the dead. Here Langland wrote his poem. The vision of William concerning Piers the Plowman is a huge poem of alliterative verse divided into a large number of passages or cantos. Professor Skid distinguishes three main versions: A, B, and C. Text B and C appear to represent latter alliterations or revisions at different times. The first version is believed to have the first the first version is believed to have been written about 1362, the second about 1377, and the third about 1398. The prologue describes how on a May morning the poet fell asleep by the side of a brook on the Malvern Hills and saw in a vision or dream a fair field full of folk. It is a bustling scene crowded with people of all sorts, honest as well as dishonest, plowmen, merchants and minstrels, pilgrims, hermits, friars, palmers, pardoners, and churchmen. The cantos then develop the allegory. A lovely lady appears and tells the dreamer to seek the truth. On his asking what is truth, she tells him it is love. Two other characters are then introduced. The name of the characters are Falsehood and Lady Mead. A marriage between the two is proposed but is opposed by theology. They then proceed to London to obtain the king's verdict. On the king's threatening them with punishment, Falsehood and company run away. Lady Mead confesses her sins to a friar. She is promised salvation if she presents new windows to the friar's convent. This cheap method of winning salvation is then denounced by the author. The king then proposes to marry Mead to his knight, whose name was Conscience. But Conscience objects and denounces the lady. So reason is called, and after a long argument in which wit, wisdom, and wrong take part, he decides that no mercy should be shown to wrong, and that every good deed should be rewarded. The king is so pleased with reason that he decides to keep him always as his counselor. At this point, the scene changes to the field of folk, and reason asks them to seek Saint Truth and not Saint James or other saints at Rome. Then follows the repentance of the crowd and the confession of seven deadly sins so common in medieval literature. The sins are pride, luxury, envy, wrath, avarice, gluttony, and sloth. The confession of the glutton is the most brilliant and dramatic. On his way to the church, he is tempted by a brewer woman to drink, and he gets so drunk as to wake up 2 days later. The repentant crowd decide to start on their pilgrimage in search of truth, but no one knows the way. At this point appears Piers Plowman, after whom the poem is named. He promises to lead the company after he has ploughed his half acre of land. He asks everybody to work hard at his job, and those who refuse or shirk are made to work by hunger. As they are about to start on the journey, Pierce receives from Truth the Pope's pardon, covering not only Pierce and his heirs, but all who help Pierce ploughing and sowing. A priest who reads the paper finds no pardon, but only the simple statement that those who do good will get salvation and those who do evil will be damned. The poem, in its first version, ends here with the poet's passionate plea that only good works can obtain salvation and not pardons and indulgences. The rest of the poem, comprising the second and third version, is the sequel to the first, and it contains the triple vision of duel, debate, and dubest. However, it is complicated. It is chaotic to be reduced to a coherent summary. The author does not succeed in his second or third attempt to round off his religious or moral lesson. The general impression is that the author was in search of good life, of salvation, of God. At the end, mercy is shown as triumphant over strict justice. Next writer is John Gore, whose lifetime is 1332 to 1408. So Gower is one of the best writer in this era. He was a court poet like Chaucer was both his friend and rival. Chaucer, in his dedication of Troilus and Cressida to Gower, calls him moral goer. It was Chaucer title to the goer, moral goer. Actually, moral goer was a title that has stuck to him ever since. He was a typical poet of the time who wrote in three languages such as French, Latin, and English. His French works consist of some 50 ballads or love songs and one huge poem, Speculum Meditantis. Speculum Meditantis was a long sermon in verse on the immorality of the age. His Latin work is Vox Clementis. It is concerned with Watts Taylor rebellion of 1381. As he was a landlord of Kent, the country in which the rebellion had broken out, he was frightened. Having a vested interest, he voiced in this poem his own fears of the nightmarish uprising. Though not in sympathy with the popular cause, he vehemently denounces the social evils which had led to popular disaffection. The poem ends with an appeal to the high and mighty to mend their ways and to listen to the voice of the people, which is the voice of God. Gore's English work was titled Confessio Amentis. It is an enormous poem of 14,000 lines. It is an octosyllabic lines. He says he wrote this at the instance of King Richard, who had complained that nobody wrote in the English tongue. The subject is love, not because it is to the poet's taste. He would much rather write a moral book, but because the people preferred amusement to wisdom. The poet approaches Venus. Venus is the goddess of love. Venus asks him to make his confession to her priest. The priest's name was Genius. Genius was a personage borrowed from Roman de la Rose. Before hearing the confession, Genius tells him stories to illustrate the seven deadly sins and their subdivisions so that the poet may know if he is guilty and confess accordingly. After the confession, the poet is mocked and dismissed by Venus as being too old for love. He is advised to stick to morality which he has pursued so long. The stories drawn from classical and medieval sources are curious and interesting, and some of them were borrowed by Chaucer. But their connection with morals drawn from them is absurd. Gore shows power and fluency of narration, but he is too long winded and hopelessly dull. The fact is that though he had enough learning and was not lacking in grace, he was too puritanical to write successfully of love. He lacked vivacity, charm, humor, qualities which Chaucer possessed in an eminent degree and which he himself admits in his rival when he makes Venus adopt Chaucer as her true devotee. He should have been content with being moral goer. So here John Gore is completed.